I don't mind. I'm excited about this new
Ted Lasso video.
Wow. Who knew
Ted Lasso video.
be so healthy and so heavy?
Ted Lasso Season 4 has shocked me. There's only 2 episodes out at the time of recording this, I should explain, so I don't know what's ahead for the season, but right now, it's done something quite bold and unexpected, and I want to talk about it. For context, I've been skeptical about this season, having previously wrapped everything up nicely with Season 3. Even then, my feelings about this show have always been quite mixed as well. On the one hand, it's been able to explore heartfelt themes in a mature and only sometimes heavy-handed way. It's got an irresistible charm to it. I love football, and on the other hand, it is sometimes very heavy-handed. Season 3 didn't fully deliver on everything it intended. I have an array of videos discussing both the good and bad of that season, and call it personal taste, but I don't think this show has ever made me laugh. I mean, it probably has. I've probably forgotten a few occasions, but it's kind of weird that this is a comedy and it doesn't make me laugh, and yet I still enjoy it a lot. Sometimes I feel like Trent Crimm of Season 1, who's ready to criticise all the little flaws of Ted, and yet just can't help but like him, can't help but be one around. I thought Season 1 was genuinely very good. Season 2 had issues, but a wonderfully captivating arc for Nate. Season 3 simplified a lot of things that had been building up a bit too much and had moments I didn't like, but still wrapped up the show with a fitting, heartfelt send-off that I was very happy with. It was concluded. The idea they'd ever make more of this show? No, I didn't want it. It had both finished very nicely, but I think also showing signs of running out of steam. I do think every consecutive season has been worse than the one before. I've not been convinced there'd be enough for a Season 4 to feel fresh, and not like it's just running the same characters into the ground now, which would be the worst thing. However, I think I'm being proved wrong. Episode 2 is one of the best episodes I can remember seeing in a long time, and there's a very specific reason for that, and we're going to discuss it all. Are you ready for a really cool train? So if you saw my video about Season 4 Episode 1, you remember I said it felt very hard to judge this show so far because the story didn't really get going at all there. The whole episode was more like a very long prologue to try and explain why the hell Ted would come back, and whilst it wasn't a bad episode, it didn't really grip me as a result. I said Episode 2 would be a better judge because that's the actual beginning of the story, and immediately the first thing that grips me here is Coach Alice Chilton. Exactly the right kind of character to freshen the show up again, because she's very capable, she's clever, I would assume strategically talented when it comes to football. We don't actually know that, but I think we're meant to imply it from our understanding of football statistics, which, by the way, I love. This show is now talking about progressive passes and expected goals. I can't tell you how happy that makes me, as someone who does geek out over this stuff a lot in real life.
Had them in goals, progressive passes, and her expected goal rate per game was 0.78.
Long live the improved tactical understanding in the writer's room here. In the words of Joe Devine, yes. So she is skills, I suppose, in the way Nate was, but crucially doesn't get along with the rest of the club. Comes across a bit cold or stern, or as the show implies, a bit of a
C-word. Caroline C-word.
Crucially, this is not true. And in fact, this of course has been a running theme for the show, that people who can seem cold at first to other characters are actually not at all under the surface. I mean, Rebecca once seemed very cold and quite intimidating to Higgins, especially in Season 1, but she's actually lovely. Sharon in Season 2 seemed cold and unwelcoming to Ted, but that's because she didn't go in for his over-friendliness to charm, and was more interested in getting to the root of him. She was very professional. Season 3, the waitress, I've forgotten her name now. She seemed cold to Nate because we were looking from his perspective, where he's expecting to feel terribly judged and scorned by all romantic interests, but she wasn't at all. She had a natural defensiveness, which is understanding in a waitress role. And now, Alice. You may note all 4 of those examples are women. I don't think we should read too much into that, because Trent, Crimm, and Roy could also be added to this list of the same kind of dynamic. But regardless, they see Alice as cold and unfriendly, and I think that's great here, because I think it highlights one of the big flaws with the happy community feel Ted built for this place. The fact everyone is now expected to subscribe to it. Everyone is expected to run on with tangents about movies and have biscuits with the boss and all fun family aspects, all the stuff that's been cultivated, things that are positive and jolly, but also risk creating an in-group in this system where people don't match that kind of energy, are judged harshly, seen as not fun, seen as a buzzkill to the group dynamic. We'll note how incredibly easily Rebecca is offended by Alice to such an extent she spends the entire episode reading feminist literature and crashing out about one comment from Alice. I don't think that's just because it hits at the very thing Rebecca wants to fight for, but also because Rebecca, doesn't like Alice, basically. Has it in her head that she's some very judgmental and stern person, so much so that when a single comment is dropped, Rebecca treats it as the maximum insult, rather than just maybe being empathetic to the fact Alice had her heart set on a job and felt passed over by Ted Lasso. That is understandably upsetting for her. Alice is seen too much as part of the out group for them to really empathise with her feelings beyond just seeing her as scary and a bit cold, and that's because she doesn't subscribe to all of the same overly friendly stuff that everyone else has kind of built this culture to be. And so enter Ted. He's the guy who did first cultivate this family feel here, right? So obviously he's going to side with Rebecca, Keeley and Higgins. Obviously he'll also feel the same about Alice, that she doesn't fit the environment. They're very keen to have Ted agree with them on this, but nope. Ted knows better than that. He kind of learnt this in season 2 with Sharon bringing a different dynamic, not subscribing to the same one, and how that was actually what was needed at the time, you know? A healthy system of organisational dynamics does not mean dividing the community into different in-groups and out-groups, nor does it mean everybody falling to the same tune. Generally, in terms of groups, it raises people's anxiety when people have sort of different dynamics and different approaches going on all the time. You see this in the show The Traitors, which I talk about a lot. People who seem different in any way, not necessarily like in appearance or background or anything, but in the behaviour. Anyone who seems different is seen more like a threat. Generally, those people tend to be othered, but in a healthy dynamic, you want difference. You want people to challenge each other. You want to have lots of different things added to the melting pot. As human beings, we tend to try and remove those differences within groups to kind of ease a lot of our stress, to make things feel simplified, but that's not beneficial to the organisation itself. Ted doesn't see Alice as someone cold, and when she says things to him that could be taken that way, he is totally unabashed by them.
Let me guess, you heard I was rude, difficult to work with, a real bitch.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
Not just because he's in full disarm charm mode, but also because he understands her better than that. She's not at all cold, really. She cares a great deal, both about the sports and the people. She's honest, she's firm in her conviction, she's very, very professional, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, you know? And potentially she has autism. I suspect, based on media conventions, that she is written as autistic. But I also don't like to assume, because traits of autism do overlap with so many things, and I've had a lot of experiences at work where teachers or parents were absolutely convinced their child had autism only for it to be something else. Typically trauma symptoms, but not exclusively. I think it's a bit different with an adult, but I guess it's just not my habit to assume anything until we're shown. I suspect that's what we're meant to assume, but yeah. If we do suppose she has autism, however, we can look at the way she's received as reflective not just of an in-group, out-group mentality, where her own employers literally bitch about her, by the way, but also an expectation that the neurodiverse should accommodate their behaviour to fit in, rather than that the team could understand and make space for who she is. You know, this is often typical. Like, Ted Lasso in season 1 had to go to extreme lengths in order to bond with the staff around him, principally Rebecca. He baked her biscuits every single day, and if he hadn't put in that kind of effort, his career at Richmond probably would have ended in failure. It's ridiculous he ever had to do that, but he did, and it's a part of why he was then able to succeed. Alice obviously hasn't put in that same kind of work, and maybe then you can argue it's her failure to bond with the team, to not make the extra effort. To an extent, I mean, I once argued Dr. Sharon should have done more in her therapy role to appear more approachable at the beginning of her time at Richmond. It's something I was taught to be mindful of in my training as a therapist, but that's as a therapist, that's part of their job. Because it's also true she shouldn't have to do anything like that, and if this is supposed to be a well-run and well-led organisation, Rebecca and the other team, the leadership, should make the effort to understand her and help her to integrate in a way that works for everyone.
Let me guess, you heard I was rude, difficult to work with, A real bitch.
What she also has is zero patience for Ted's waffling. Stuff that to her appears irrelevant to the job and probably makes him look like some disinterested guy who doesn't take the job seriously like she does, and when he did just pip her to the job you were wanting, of course that's going to sting. Of course she's going to be reluctant to acknowledge Ted's own skills. And even more so, he is a man stepping into the world of women's football knowing absolutely nothing about it, or at least that's the impression we're given. Ted doesn't know a damn thing. I think the twist at the end is he kind of does, but you know, that's the nice structure across this episode, where she is a woman who has worked hard at this all her life. Why should he deserve the job over her? Why should he deserve the recognition, the reward for everything she's put in to get this team started? It is very sweet getting to see Ted increasingly recognising Alice's talents, but also Alice increasingly being won around by Ted until the end the two are agreeing to work together. And I just think this is the dynamic that always made this show most effective. Ted seeming a little bumbling in the face of someone who doesn't take him seriously, and the push and pull as he gradually wins people around and brings out the best of them. That was what made season 1 so clear in its structure. I'm glad to see a similar dynamic occurring here, but different enough that it doesn't feel like repetition. We need this kind of friction, especially the fact Rebecca is still so uneasy and clearly unhappy that Alice is staying. I think that friction is good. It's easy after several seasons to just soften away all the characters' worst aspects for the sake of feel-good vibes, but I'm glad to see Rebecca and others treating Alice unfairly. It makes for good story, it gives Ted room to matter again. I love him offering her the job, or at least, that's not the right, convincing her not to resign, because he reveals an understanding of her as a person. He's not just some lazy, bumbling coach who had success at the highest levels and so thinks he can walk into a very different world of second league women's football. He's someone who not just studied her dossier carefully, but took the time to learn about her as well, her background, because he cares, because she matters to the team. Half of what's upset Alice is the feeling she's been totally overlooked, passed over by someone who wasn't interested to understand her or credit her talent. Ted does recognise it though. Also, cruciate ligament injuries are hilarious. No, not hilarious. Horrendous. Yes, so many footballers have had their careers destroyed by that injury, and even the ones who do come back from it often aren't quite the same player they were. Definitely not hilarious. And I imagine even more so in women's football that to be the case, because they won't have the same funding for the same team of physios with all sorts of facilities that the men's team will get. It's a devastating injury. It's always awful, which perhaps brings us round to the second point I wanted to discuss. So there's a lot of difficult problems that inevitably come up if you're going to make the season about women's football, and that's because women's football itself has a lot of problems, most notably the finances, and I'm really glad the show is taking this seriously. It would be too easy to just paint over the problems for the sake of a feel-good vibe, just have like Rebecca easily find investment to fund the team and never let it be an issue. Draw on the struggles faced of direct sexism from certain groups of football fans and how it's unfair women's TV doesn't get as much coverage, but then kind of leave it at that, you know? That could have been too easy for it to do. I was kind of worried the season would play it safe and take that kind of lukewarm approach to the issues, but it appears not to be doing so. The thing about women's football, at least in the UK, and at least as far as I understand, I'm not an expert here at all. If anyone knows better, please do correct me in the comments. But the thing is, it kind of depends on the men's game in order to survive. I got a comment on the last video suggesting it was sexist that Richmond are setting up a women's team that's invariably a bit like a branch off of the men's squad. They're both Richmond FC, you know? Like, why can't they make an entire original women's team, not Richmond branded at all, its own totally independent thing, which in an ideal world would definitely be a lot better. But this is where women's football struggles, because it's not as easy as that due to the fact it just doesn't have the same level of following at the moment. Women's football is still relatively young when you think about many of the men's football clubs being established in like the 1800s. It takes a long time to grow a fan base, and that means a long time to get the same kind of funding. Whilst a lot of people support women's football, how many actually pay money to attend the games, provide revenue through ticket sales, you know? How many watch it on TV? And so when the following is low, the money accrued from sponsorship is going to be low, as well as all the ticket sales and that kind of revenue. It's difficult then to get as big investment from multi-millionaires, because they expect a return on their investments. They expect a sustainable business, and the question Rebecca is currently facing is exactly that. Is there a sustainable business here. One of the advantages to building a team out of the same club as the men's is A, it allows you to slightly tap into the existing fan base. Will people who support Richmond FC men's now start to become curious about the Lady Greyhounds, as they're called? Will they perhaps start to attend some games? It's probably quite a low percentage that do that, but you've got potential there. There's space to grow into. There's this whole audience to attract. And you know, when the vast majority of UK football clubs were established in the 1800s and were born directly out of working class communities set up by ordinary people, many of those clubs remain a bedrock in their communities, tying local people together. Of course, like clubs like Liverpool are a global brand as well, but they're also a strong local presence, like Everton, that is a huge part of the entire city's identity. So there's a lot to tap into there, and also if it's difficult to be sustainable on your own, some of the profits that the club might be gaining from the men's team can be invested into the women's to help grow it when it's necessary, because there's still a bit of a trap here. To afford good training facilities for your women's team, you do need investment. To afford a whole squad of good staff, to afford physio equipment, to afford a stadium to play in. It seems the Richmond team will use the men's stadium, but that's not always the case for reasons such as like scheduling. What do you do if the men's and women's team are both scheduled to play at the same time? There's also the atmosphere. If you've got like a 60,000 seater stadium but only 5,000 people attend to watch the women's game, is that going to make the atmosphere feel hollow? Is it just going to be like an empty stadium? And then if less people are attending, can it pragmatically afford all the security, the staffing, everything that needs to be running to cover this entire large stadium when you're not getting that many ticket sales for it? Plus like the wear and tear to the pitch, that costs a lot involved in maintaining that. A lot of the biggest teams are starting to use the same stadiums as the men's. I think Arsenal women are doing that for all their home games from like this year onwards or last year onwards or something. Clubs that have recently built new stadiums such as Everton have given their old ground Goodison Park to the women's team, but again the costs can make this difficult. Those are both very big teams. Richmond is not supposed to be that. We should not forget this is not a big club finance wise. So there's a ton of stuff you can't afford until you have a bigger following and a bigger revenue, but it's very difficult to grow that following until you can afford all of the better stuff and can compete with all of the other women's teams. It's a bit of a vicious cycle. There's also things like the myths or the perspective people have on women's football, the narrative there's been culturally. There's been a stereotypical argument of the past few decades that I think might finally be dying out now, but that women's football just isn't as good. They're not as skilled. It's not as entertaining. This is the argument a lot of people make as to why they don't watch it where they do watch the men's, and to an extent there is some truth to this because there isn't hundreds of millions of pounds invested into academies for young girls all over the country. The level of coaching a girl might get at 8 years old, 10 years old, 16 years old is a lot lower than that of a boy. I cannot tell you how much money is pumped into developing very young football players from the very earliest stages. And so again, it's very hard to invest in creating better academies and better coaching without a lot of long-term investment that goes beyond just your individual club. This is talking about academies all over the country. Also scouting networks, coaching. It's definitely getting there. I think people are starting to recognise women's football, and I think there is starting to become a lot more investment in academies than there was. The fan base has definitely grown a lot in the last decade or so, but it is still a long-term project and it is very tricky. Liverpool or Arsenal have an easier time affording a women's team because they're already massive global brands with billionaire investors built in who might see a women's team as a long-term asset. But not all clubs can see it that way, and not all clubs can afford to wait for long-term dividends, and Richmond, it appears, certainly can't. It's a really tricky problem. If Rebecca wants the team to survive, she has to somehow convince a lot of very rich people to invest in what looks like an unsustainable model right now, or she has to somehow grow the fan base and the revenue very quickly, or find some other creative solution to make it as sustainable as possible. And it's not been said, but I think this is probably one of the reasons she hired Ted for the manager role, that he can bring a bit of fame, a bit of attention, a bit of feel-good factor to the women's team. A lot of Richmond men supporters who think fondly of Ted Lasso may now be interested in the women's team. You know, Coach Lasso, winner of the men's Premier League title, coming back to coach the women in League Two is a hell of a headline, you know? And is also uncomfortable because because again, it is relying on men in order for the women's team to survive and to grow. Alice can't bring that same kind of appeal, no matter how qualified she is or undeserving of this situation she's in. I again like that friction. I again like the uncomfortable fact it is relying a lot on the men's game. I think they should be honest about that and explore it, because that means taking the situation seriously. And it's clearly something I want to do. I think Bill Lawrence has always been quite good about that, really researching the subjects he's exploring and exploring it truthfully. I don't know what Rebecca does in honesty. I don't know what the solution is, but I'm glad the show has set up a lot of the challenges, because they do deserve to be highlighted, and it wouldn't do women's football justice to just tell this in a very surface level way. They're not playing it safe. I didn't expect this kind of boldness. I'm really happy to see it. The fact even they can make jokes about Rebecca trying to force an image of her support for women, that's quite good. That they can allow Ted to still feel a bit awkward and out of his comfort zone. That they even highlight the problem of Ted walking into a women's dressing room. It feels like they're taking the subject matter seriously and trying to do it justice. So far, they're doing, I think, the entire setting justice. I feel like they're exploring a lot more about football again. It's not just a mention of things like progressive passes or seeing the ways Roy tried to sabotage the away team. It's just nice in general to get little things like that that just expand your understanding, make the world feel more alive and fresh and interesting again. I think it does feel fresh not just by virtue of there being new characters, but also new problems, different kinds of challenges. If the show absolutely had to come back for a 4th season, it needed that, and I think it really does this well. And crucially, this episode made me laugh. I can't remember what I laughed at anymore. It might just have been because the last show I'd watched before this had been Ricky Gervais's Alley Cats, and I think anything seems hilarious when set against that. Or it might just be how good a mood this episode put me in, that I feel excited about this show again. I felt buoyed by the potential. I think I probably was really just laughing because I've started to feel like I'm in for a treat, but that's a massive point of praise on its own. Ted Lasso made me laugh. Yeah. I'm going to give this episode a 10 out of 10 as a result of that. But let me know what you think. I know this video is coming very late. We've had a very stressful and difficult week with the baby. I've been delayed on a lot of things, but hopefully you can still enjoy this. Comment your thoughts, good or bad. Like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Maybe support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Luke Gore, Michael Gallagher, Emery, Faithy, DQM, Kinesthetic, Maury, Sebastian, Alicia, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.